It begins with an unsettling possibility that the oldest stories humanity ever recorded were not myths, not metaphors, not primitive attempts to explain the natural world, but memories. Memories of encounters, catastrophes, cycles, and intelligences that predate everything modern history claims to know. On clay tablets baked by ancient fires, on cuneiform lines pressed by hands long turned to dust, the Sumerians left behind quiet statements of impossible things. Reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, kings who descended from the sky, cities already ancient before history supposedly began, and a blueprint of civilization appearing suddenly, as if delivered whole. What if those tablets were never meant to be sacred stories? What if they were records, preserved fragments of an older world? What if humanity did not rise slowly from darkness, but returned from it? These questions linger like a cold breeze through the corridors of time, unsettling because they hint at something deliberate, something structured beneath the Sumerian world. Something vast enough to challenge the foundations of our timeline. Something old enough to question whether we truly understand who walked this earth before us. And the deeper one goes into the Sumerian record, the more it feels less like reading the past and more like remembering it. If you enjoy these quiet explorations into the forgotten corners of our past, feel free to like or subscribe. It helps this space remain gentle, curious, and unhurried. And as we begin, may I softly ask, where are you listening from, and what time has this story found you? Whether you're watching the visuals or simply letting the words guide you in the dark, know that they're optional. The story stands on its own. So take a moment now to get comfortable, dim the lights, and settle in. Let the noise of the world drift away until it's just you and the oldest written memories of humankind. In the south of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath the dust of countless ages, workers once cleared a mound of broken mud brick and fractured pottery. The place seemed like any forgotten ruin, silent, wind-blown, and stubbornly unremarkable. But as they dug deeper, they uncovered carefully cut rectangular chambers lined with clay tablets preserved by an ancient fire. The site was Nippur, spiritual heart of Sumer. Among the soot-blackened storage rooms lay tablets that would challenge not only archaeology, but the entire architecture of human history. One tablet in particular was small, about the size of an adult hand. It carried rows of neat, deliberate cuneiform. The excavators assumed it was another administrative record. Grain rations, beer allocations, tax lists. Instead, they were stunned. It was a king list, but not like any known king list from Egypt or Assyria. This one described rulers whose reigns stretched far beyond the boundaries of human possibility. 28,800 years, read one line. 36,000 years, read another. Entire dynasties summing into hundreds of thousands of years. To hold that tablet was to touch a riddle. To read it was to encounter a world that should not exist. Scholars called it the Sumerian king list, but the name barely captures its strangeness. It begins with an assertion so simple, so calm, that it feels like the quiet edge of a thunderclap. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The phrase is presented not as myth, but fact. As if kingship, the idea of organized rule, of structured society, of civilization, was not invented but delivered, lowered, bestowed. And in that first city, the first ruler did not reign for a mortal span. According to the tablet, He ruled for 28,800 years. The number is not symbolic. It is not poetic. It is written the same way Sumerians wrote actual tax numbers, market inventories, and agricultural yields. This was the first doorway. Through it, the rest of the Sumerian world unfolds with a strange, compelling logic. The cities appear abruptly around 300 and 800 BCE, with no known developmental phase. Writing, astronomy, mathematics, legal codes, and irrigation appear with stunning completeness, and behind it all loom the Anuna, a collective of beings described as those who came from the sky, those who ordained destinies, the ancient ones. For mainstream scholars, these are gods, just gods, nothing more. But why then are their descriptions so technical, so administrative, so strangely precise? As the chambers of Nippur revealed more tablets, patterns formed. Patterns difficult to explain within a simple mythological framework. There were calendars mapping celestial cycles with uncanny accuracy, lists of star constellations, some invisible to the naked eye, catalogs of plants and minerals described with an almost clinical taxonomy, and references, whispered ones, to catastrophes so intense that the entire world seemed to have been wiped clean more than once. But in Sumer, nothing feels random. Everything is written quietly, methodically, as if the scribes believed they were documenting a truth they expected future generations to rediscover. In that first chamber, the air would have been dry and still, dust motes drifting like slow stars. The workers might not have understood the magnitude of what they held. How could they? Clay tablets do not shout, they whisper. Yet those whispers carry a gravity capable of bending the arc of history itself. And so a question began to take shape, the kind that tugs at the edges of accepted history. How could the earliest civilization humanity recognizes be so sudden, so complete, and so strangely aware of cycles, kings, and celestial order stretching back into unreachable time? Scholars, trying to understand, dug deeper, both literally and metaphorically. As they did, the anomalies multiplied. One such anomaly rests in Eridu, another ancient Sumerian site often called the First City. Today it lies in ruins, its once sacred ziggurat ground down by millennia of erosion. But beneath its crumbling surface, archaeologists found something that made them pause. The city had 17 layers, each representing a phase of rebuilding over vast periods. The lowest layers date so far back that they almost blur into prehistory, into the time before cities were supposed to exist. In those deepest strata, the pottery is primitive, but the layout, astonishingly, already mirrors later Sumerian city plans. It is as though the blueprint of civilization was introduced all at once at the earliest level, then merely repeated or restored again and again. This orderly structure emerging from nowhere has no easy explanation. Civilization should develop gradually, experimentation, failures, trials. But Eridu begins as if someone set out a template and humanity simply followed it. From the king list to the earliest cities, the pattern whispered the same thing. Something older lies beneath the surface of recorded time. Tablet fragments from Uruk add another layer. These describe the Anuna not as omnipotent gods, but as beings who descended, departed, returned, and in some cases withdrew to the heavenly boats. Their actions follow structured duties, assignments, councils, territorial oversight, not the chaotic whims of mythology. More like administrators emerging from an older epoch, or from somewhere else entirely. Further west, excavations at Mari uncovered a set of tablets describing the Me, a term often translated as divine decrees, but which reads more like a list of civilizational modules, concepts, categories, knowledge systems that were bestowed upon humanity. Agriculture is one, kingship is another, temple construction, music, mathematics, writing. These are not discovered or invented in the narrative. They are given, transferred, handed down. By whom? And why? Meanwhile, tablets from Lagash describe a catastrophe that reshaped the world long before Sumer's rise. They speak of a time when the foundations of heaven and earth were shaken, when the great waters covered the land, when the old order was destroyed. This is not unique to Sumer. Nearly every ancient culture has a flood narrative, but the Sumerian version is the oldest known. And intriguingly, it describes multiple cycles, not a single deluge. The people had perished once before. The cities had been ruined once before. Kingship had been withdrawn once before. This repetition echoes eerily with the king list, where dynasties are divided by catastrophic floods. After each disaster, kingship is lowered again, resetting the human story. Mainstream scholars argue these cycles symbolize spiritual renewal or agricultural metaphors. But why then do the reigns and events maintain such consistent numerical patterns? Why do they map so neatly onto long-term astronomical cycles? It's as if the world was rebooted, restored from backup, rebuilt from a template. Another anomaly comes from astronomy. The Sumerians tracked celestial bodies with extraordinary precision. Their records include star lists, eclipse cycles, and mathematical systems that seem much more sophisticated than a culture supposedly only a few centuries removed from pre-agricultural life. Most perplexing is their use of a base 60 numerical system, sexagesimal mathematics, which historians still cannot fully explain. Why would the earliest civilization choose such a complex system, and how did they use it so effortlessly? Some tablets describe calculations of planetary motions that modern scholars struggle to reconcile with naked-eye astronomy. There are curious references to a wandering star of great returning and a dark body unseen that crosses the deep. Whether these were metaphors or misunderstood observations remains debated, but their presence adds to the growing mystery. How could people at the dawn of recorded time possess such multi-layered knowledge? Then there is Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic with roots deep in Sumerian myth. It describes a celestial collision between worlds, resulting in the formation of Earth as we know it. Until the 20th century, such an idea seemed fantastical. But today, modern planetary science acknowledges something strikingly similar: the giant impact hypothesis, which posits that a Mars-sized body collided with early Earth, creating the Moon. How could Sumerians preserve a narrative mirroring scientific models proposed only in recent decades? Archaeology offers its explanations: metaphor, myth, allegory, beautiful stories, symbolic language, ritual poetry. But the tablet scribes wrote them as records, not fables. They used the same administrative precision they applied to land measurements and tax inventories. Even their descriptions of gods rely more on structure, role, and function than divine chaos. And when describing human origins, the text has become even more peculiar. Some tablets speak of a time when humans were created to bear the labor, fashioned by those who decreed destinies. The phrasing is calm, clinical, never embellished, Whether symbolic or literal, the tone is unmistakably procedural. Yet the Sumerians themselves never claim they invented this story. Instead, they repeatedly insist they inherited it. In the ruins of ancient Shuruppak, scribes named ancestors stretching back into the deep past, referencing the olden days before the flood, a time when the cities were built far away. One fragment even suggests that writing existed before the catastrophe, preserved by a select group who carried the tablets to safety. The idea that knowledge survived a world-changing disaster appears not only in Sumer, but across multiple early civilizations. But the Sumerians treat it as history, not legend. Their oldest kings rule impossibly long spans. Their cities begin too early. Their astronomical knowledge seems misplaced in time. And through it all, they insist they were not the first. They describe the Anunna as beings who returned after the flood, not as newly born gods. They portray kingship as restored, not invented. They reference previous worlds, older societies, earlier cycles. The deeper one listens to their voices through the tablets, the more it sounds like they are recounting fragments from a larger, hidden epoch, an epoch erased by catastrophe. But as powerful as these anomalies are, mainstream scholarship provides counterpoints meant to preserve the standard timeline. Historians argue that exaggerated reign lengths reflect symbolic numerology, not literal time spans. They assert that the sudden appearance of Sumerian civilization reflects a threshold effect, where cumulative small innovations finally reached a tipping point. They suggest that astronomical precision emerged gradually through centuries of careful observation. These explanations are reasonable, grounded, and careful. They aim to preserve continuity, to avoid rewriting the story of human progress. But each explanation works only in isolation. When the anomalies are stacked together, the reign lengths, the cycles, the sudden urban complexity, the astronomical sophistication, they form a pattern more difficult to dismiss. Why would symbolic numbers consistently match long-term celestial cycles? Why would the earliest cities emerge fully formed, with standard layouts and complex administration already in place? Why would myths from unrelated cultures echo the same catastrophic resets? And why do so many Sumerian texts speak of inheritance, restoration, and memory, rather than invention? The mainstream view holds because it must, because rewriting the origins of civilization requires rethinking everything built upon them. Yet even in academic circles, quiet conversations continue, acknowledging that the Sumerians feel less like the first civilization and more like the last survivors of something older. As research deepened, another layer of evidence emerged, one harder to dismiss. Geological studies along the Mesopotamian floodplain indicate multiple episodes of massive inundation predating the known historical floods. Sediment cores show abrupt transitions between human occupation layers and massive water-deposited strata, suggesting a pattern of destruction and rebuilding eerily similar to the cycles described in the tablets. One such stratum beneath Shuruppak dates to around 5,000 years ago, consistent with the timing of the legendary flood of Ziusudra, Sumer's Noah figure. But deeper layers indicate older catastrophes, aligning with the king list's multiple withdrawals and restorations of kingship. If Sumer's earliest stories sound like memories, the land beneath them contains the fingerprints of those memories. Yet perhaps the most unnerving discovery is linguistic. As researchers analyzed Sumerian, a language isolate with no known relatives, they began noticing something odd. Words describing advanced concepts, like astronomical bodies, architectural terms, or agricultural processes, appear more consistent and ancient than basic vocabulary, such as family terms. Usually the reverse is true. Everyday words are the oldest in a language. This suggests one of two possibilities. Either Sumerian descended from an unknown parent language with advanced terminology, or these concepts were introduced all at once, inherited rather than developed. Both explanations raise questions. Both hint at something older still waiting to emerge. By now, the puzzle becomes overwhelming. Tablets documenting extended reigns, cities built on templates, knowledge appearing suddenly, catastrophes described with clinical precision, myths that sound like memories, a worldview centered on cycles, not linear progress, and always the same quiet implication. Humanity has lived through more than one beginning. The Sumerians simply wrote it down. Some researchers argue that memory can stretch across generations through myth, evolving into story but preserving a core truth. Others go further, proposing that memory can survive cataclysm through survivors who reconstruct their world, teaching descendants fragments of older knowledge. But the Sumerians complicate this idea. They do not claim to be the inheritors of fragments, but of entire systems. They describe kingship as restored as before. They describe knowledge as returning in its appointed time. They describe the Anuna as leaving and returning, not inventing or emerging. What if the Sumerian world was the last echo of an earlier civilization, one lost to deep time, whose survivors rebuilt in the cradle of Mesopotamia? What if humanity's story did not ascend from primitive to advanced, but fell from advanced to fragmented, then rose again? And what if the clay tablets are the only surviving blueprint of that forgotten cycle? These questions linger, not as definitive answers, but as invitations to look deeper, to read the Sumerian world not as myth, but as memory, to see the anomalies not as random quirks, but as clues pointing toward an earlier, erased chapter of humanity. Because somewhere beneath the layers of dust, beneath the fragments of cities rebuilt across millennia, beneath the numbers and cycles and quiet assertions of inheritance, lies a story waiting to be remembered. And it begins with clay tablets in a silent chamber in Nippur. Tablets that whisper of kings that lived before kings, of worlds that lived before worlds, and of a humanity far older and far stranger than we ever imagined. The deeper scholars ventured into the Sumerian world, the more it began to resemble an archive, one that seemed less like the beginning of civilization and more like the end of a prior chapter. Among the tablets retrieved from Nippur, Uruk, and Shuruppak, certain texts stood out not for their mythology but for their tone. They read as chronicles, not parables, as logs, not legends. And this quiet administrative voice, calm, methodical, almost dispassionate, carried with it the weight of something older, something carried across upheavals. One text, often overshadowed by the king list, is known today as the Instructions of Shuruppak, a father's advice to his son, Ziusudra. At first glance, it appears mundane. Warnings about friendships, advice on honesty, reminders about social behavior. But woven into these lines are references to a world in transition, a world anticipating catastrophe. The advice is framed as though knowledge is slipping, as though a father is passing down the last remnants of a fading age. Ziusudra, the same figure who would later appear as the lone survivor of a cataclysm, is told to guard the old ways, to remember what came before, and to keep safe the words that the ancestors wrote. The tone is not metaphorical, it is urgent. And when these tablets are placed back into context with the geological evidence beneath Shuruppak, the ground begins to shift beneath the mainstream narrative. For in the very soil of Shuruppak, in the sediment layers that separate pre-flood occupation from post-flood rebuilding, scientists discovered something startling. A layer of river-deposited silt, roughly 60 centimeters thick, lying directly between two distinct cultural levels. The layer is sudden, uniform, intrusive, a signature consistent with a massive flood. But what lies below this flood layer complicates everything further. Beneath the silt, archaeologists found house foundations, pottery, and tools belonging to a culture already mature, organized, and astonishingly sophisticated for its time. The flood did not mark the beginning of Sumerian civilization. It interrupted it. It reset it. And when life re-emerged above the silt, the same cultural blueprint returned almost unchanged, as if following instructions already known, already preserved. This continuity across catastrophe is one of the most haunting aspects of the Sumerian story. Civilizations usually collapse slowly and rebuild differently. Styles change, technologies shift, languages diverge. But the Sumerian world, its architecture, its administrative systems, its astronomical concerns, remained astonishingly consistent before and after the flood. It is as though the Sumerians were restoring a template rather than inventing a new. And in their tablets, they say exactly that. In one text, the scribes describe the re-establishment of Eridu after the deluge. They do not call the rebuilt settlement a new creation. Instead, they describe it as the restoration of the black-headed people to their ancient places. They emphasize continuity, not origin. This continuity becomes the central thread pulling scholars deeper into the labyrinth. The Sumerians behave not like pioneers of civilization, but like guardians of a legacy whose roots extend into unreachable antiquity. As more tablets were translated over the decades, more details emerged. Details that did not fit comfortably within the narrow frame of early Bronze Age development. One of the most disquieting discoveries came from a group of tablets known collectively as the Lists of Professions. At first, these seemed like simple administrative enumerations of occupations: artisans, priests, scribes, builders. But a closer look reveals something strange. The lists include professions whose functions are unclear, even bizarre. There are roles associated with star measuring, timekeepers of the deep, inspectors of the lower sea, observers of the tablets of destiny, and keepers of the me. Some of these titles make sense within a ritual context, but others imply specialized knowledge that appears out of place in the earliest civilization. Why would the first known human society already require astronomers, archivists, and inspectors of celestial phenomena? Why would their earliest texts describe divisions of labor so layered, so structured, so reminiscent of an already elaborate culture? The mainstream explanation suggests these roles evolved gradually over generations, but the archaeological record contradicts this. The earliest urban layers already include temples, administrative buildings, workshops, and observatories, appearing not at the end of a long development, but at the very beginning. This abruptness is one of the central puzzles. Sumer does not look like the rise of civilization. It looks like the return of one. Even the language reflects this. Sumerian contains loanwords from no known culture. Its structure is unlike any familiar linguistic family. And most curious of all, certain advanced words, those describing architecture, astronomy, agriculture, metallurgy, appear consistent across all periods of Sumerian writing, with no signs of earlier, simpler forms. Linguists call this lexical inertia, a phenomenon that occurs only when vocabulary is inherited intact rather than evolving naturally. To most scholars, this remains an oddity. To others, it suggests something more profound: that the knowledge preserved by the Sumerians did not emerge in Mesopotamia, but arrived there. Several ancient texts support this interpretation. In the story of Inanna and Enki, for example, the goddess visits the god's abode and receives from him the mi, the divine decrees. But the mi are not supernatural powers. When translated without mythological gloss, they read as principles of civilization, the mi of kingship, the mi of agriculture, the mi of crafts, the mi of mathematics, the mi of astronomy, the mi of writing. Each mi corresponds not to magical concepts, but to knowledge systems, systems that appear fully formed in the earliest Sumerian cities. The narrative presents them not as inventions, but as transfers. Knowledge delivered, knowledge bestowed. If viewed literally, this story sounds like a record of knowledge transmission from one group to another. If viewed symbolically, it still hints at an origin outside Sumer. In both readings, the Sumerians position themselves not as inventors, but as recipients. And this brings us to the heart of the tension between mainstream and unaccepted interpretations. The Sumerians do not claim to have created civilization. They claim to have inherited it. Mainstream archaeology tends to interpret these claims as mythological, but the more tablets are translated, the less comfortable this interpretation becomes. Because the Sumerians describe their inheritance with bureaucratic precision, not with metaphorical language. They categorize knowledge in lists. They maintain standardized measurements. They record cycles, timelines, and genealogies stretching back into epochs modern history does not acknowledge. The question, then, is unavoidable. Where did this inheritance come from? One route leads to a theory of lost civilizations, societies predating the known agricultural revolution, perhaps erased by climate events during the Younger Dryas. Another route leads toward astronomical interpretations, that the Sumerians preserved knowledge from an earlier, advanced culture that tracked celestial cycles over immense timescales. Yet another route explores the possibility that the Sumerians were not merely chronicling human history, but encounters with an older, non-human intelligence, interpreted as divine, but described in curiously administrative terms. Whichever path one follows, the same conceptual anchor emerges. The Sumerians behave like archivists of a forgotten world. This anchor provides structure in the labyrinth. It aligns the anomalies, the sudden appearance of writing, the precision of astronomical records, the extended reigns of the early kings, the cyclic floods, the restoration of kingship, the temple blueprints, the profession lists, the strange loan words, all the fragments that do not fit neatly into the official narrative. These fragments deepen further when we examine the astronomical texts. In a collection discovered at Nineveh, but rooted in earlier Sumerian tradition, scholars found the Mulapin, a set of star catalogs containing over 70 constellations, detailed heliacal risings, planetary periods, and seasonal markers. Many of these entries require centuries of careful observation to compile. Yet the earliest versions appear abruptly, with no earlier developmental stages. Modern astronomy depends on long-term data accumulation, calibration errors, and iterative corrections. But the Muld Appian and related texts do not show such evolution. They appear as a polished system, already refined. This is not merely unusual, it is unprecedented. Civilizations typically begin with rough astronomical approximations and refine them over generations. The Sumerians start with refinement. They begin with precision. And these star lists contain another oddity: constellations that should not have been visible from Sumer during its earliest phases, unless the star maps were inherited from an older latitude or an older epoch. One example is the detailed description of the southern constellations near the horizon, which would have been extremely difficult to observe without an unobstructed view and specialized tools. Yet these constellations appear in Sumerian records as if they were familiar. The mainstream explanation is that the Sumerians adopted astronomical knowledge from earlier cultures. But this leads to a circular problem. If Sumer is the earliest known civilization, who could they have learned from? Even more intriguing is the repeated reference to long cycles, some spanning thousands of years. The Sumerians tracked eclipses using the Saros cycle. They recorded planetary conjunctions that repeat over centuries. They calculated the precession-like motions of certain stars. These require not just observation, but continuity. Continuity across generations, across catastrophes, across worlds lost and worlds rebuilt. And that continuity demands a mechanism. This is where the anchor concept deepens. The Sumerians were not merely chronicling their world, they were preserving fragments of a much older system. The tablets describing floods, resets, and restorations become clearer in this light. They are records of cycles, not simply seasonal cycles, but civilizational ones. These cycles mirror patterns found in geological data, in climate shifts, in mythologies across continents. The idea that civilizations rise and fall repeatedly, with knowledge surviving in pockets and re-emerging, is no longer fringe. It is a plausible interpretation of both geological and archaeological evidence. But the Sumerians add a layer that makes the story even more compelling. They describe these cycles with an almost mathematical calm. They treat them as expected. They treat them as known. One of the most enigmatic tablet sets comes from Sippar, where archaeologists found references to the tablets of the priests of before. These describe star positions inconsistent with the skies of early Bronze Age Mesopotamia. The tablets refer to star risings occurring at angles impossible for their latitude, as though they were copying observations made in a different part of the world, or in a different period of Earth's axial tilt. Some scholars attribute these anomalies to copying errors, but the precision of the Sumerian scribes makes this unlikely. They rarely copied anything incorrectly. When they did, they annotated the mistake. So why would they copy astronomical data inconsistent with their skies unless they believed it came from a valid, older source? The question grows heavier. Could the Sumerians have inherited star knowledge from a pre-flood civilization located somewhere else, somewhere whose skies differed from theirs? Similar questions arise when examining the Epic of Gilgamesh. Among its many layers is a curious passage describing the hero's journey to find Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood. Gilgamesh travels through regions described not as mythic dreamlands, but as geographical zones, tunnels of darkness, lands devoid of sunlight, regions across vast waters. The tone is strange. It feels like a distorted map of real places whose meanings changed through time. But one detail stands out. Utnapishtim is said to dwell at the mouth of the rivers, a phrase that has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some interpret it as symbolic, others as referring to the Persian Gulf. But older interpretations suggest it indicates a location at the edge of the known world, perhaps a remnant of a world drowned, half remembered, half lost. A place where survivors of an ancient catastrophe preserved the memory of civilizations before the deluge. If taken literally, the epic feels less like a myth and more like a search for an ancestor who lived through a previous world. And this pattern repeats across Sumerian literature. References to before the flood, before the kings, before the cities, always written calmly, almost offhandedly, as if such epochs were simply part of a larger timeline. It is this calmness that unsettles researchers. The Sumerians do not write like people discovering civilization. They write like people remembering it. This raises a delicate tension with mainstream scholarship. To preserve the conventional model of history, scholars argue that the Sumerians simply used mythic exaggeration, much like Egyptian pharaohs claiming divine descent. They argue that long reigns symbolize greatness, not literal time. They argue that kingship being lowered from heaven represents the establishment of political authority. Those interpretations are rational, careful, grounded. They are meant to keep the broader historical timeline intact. But the anomalies push back. If the reigns were symbolic, why are they mathematically consistent? If astronomical knowledge was invented locally, why does it appear fully developed with no precursor? If the flood narrative was metaphorical, why does it align with geological strata? If the Sumerians invented civilization, why do they insist they restored it? The mainstream view is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. And this incompleteness creates a space where alternative interpretations grow. Within that space emerges a grand narrative, not a definitive one, but a possibility, one that stitches together the anomalies into a coherent whole. Imagine a world before recorded history, a world where human societies had grown advanced, but were later shattered by a global climatic event. Perhaps a sudden meltwater pulse, perhaps a comet fragment. Perhaps an astronomical shift altering coastlines and weather patterns. Survivors of such an event would scatter, carrying fragments of their technical and astronomical knowledge. Over generations, most of this knowledge would fade, but in certain pockets, places with stability, water, and agricultural potential, it would persist. Mesopotamia, with its rivers and fertile plains, would attract these survivors. They would rebuild, teaching the next generation not from scratch, but from memory. Memory of star cycles, memory of flood cycles, memory of architecture, memory of time before the catastrophe. This scenario aligns with the archaeological record: sudden urbanization, sudden literacy, sudden astronomy. It aligns with geology, flood layers, abrupt climate shifts. It aligns with linguistics, inherited vocabulary with no known roots. It aligns with the Sumerian worldview, cycles, resets, restorations. But the Sumerians add one more piece, something no other ancient culture preserved with such clarity: names, timelines, rulers, and procedures of the world before. They wrote the king list not to glorify the past, but to document it. They listed rulers before the flood, not as gods, but as kings, kings with administrative roles, with defined responsibilities, with genealogies. Even if these reigns were not literally tens of thousands of years, their presence suggests that the Sumerians perceived a long continuity stretching back into deep time. And one more detail complicates the picture. The king list states that after each flood, kingship was lowered again, implying a conscious act of restoration by a group the Sumerians called the Anuna. The Anuna appear in countless texts, not as omnipotent deities, but as a council of senior figures who deliberated, assigned roles, issued decrees, and managed the affairs of the world. Their descriptions feel less divine and more administrative, less supernatural and more organizational, less mythic and more historical. If interpreted through a literal lens, they could represent elites or survivors of a prior civilization guiding early post-flood societies. If interpreted metaphorically, they still represent memory of structured authority predating Sumer. Either way, they are the thread connecting the past before the flood to the world after it. The regional spread of Sumerian influence reinforces this idea. The earliest urban settlements appear not gradually, but in clusters: Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash. Each city seems to embody a different aspect of civilization: religion, administration, writing, commerce. This specialization appears coordinated, as if planned. And this is another anomaly. The Sumerians never wrote about inventing cities. They wrote about restoring them. They claim their cities were built far away before the flood, then rebuilt in Mesopotamia afterward. If taken at face value, this suggests memory of pre-flood settlements, possibly coastal cities lost to rising waters at the end of the last ice age. Maps of early Holocene sea level rise support this. Vast portions of the Persian Gulf basin were once dry land. It may have been a cradle of early culture, later submerged, pushing survivors inland to Mesopotamia. This theory connects geology, archaeology, and the tablets into a unified narrative. A pre-flood civilization destroyed by rising waters, remembered by its survivors, restored in the plains of Sumer. But the tablets include hints of something even more provocative. References to the Anuna, descending from the sky, traveling in the boats of heaven, and departing to the far lands, have often been interpreted mythologically. But stripped of divine language, these descriptions resemble narratives of outsiders arriving with knowledge or authority, leaving after disasters, returning during rebuilding phases. Some texts even describe the Anuna convening in the Chamber of Fates, a place where they decide the destinies of cities and kings. This chamber is portrayed not as a mystical realm, but as a physical structure, often located near ziggurats or temples. If interpreted literally, this could represent a council of leaders directing reconstruction efforts after the flood. And their disappearance in later periods suggests something else, that the memories of those early figures faded as the centuries passed, leaving only mythologized echoes. The presence of highly technical references in early Sumerian texts complicates this further. Some tablets describe tools and procedures whose meanings are unclear. Artifacts of copper and sky metal, objects that measured the deep, stones that spoke, and tablets that shone like the sun. Most scholars interpret these symbolically, yet the descriptions remain oddly consistent across texts. If taken literally, they imply technologies that the later Sumerians no longer understood but attempted to describe using familiar language. This introduces another unsettling possibility, that Sumer preserved faint memories of lost technologies from an earlier epoch. Now, a mainstream voice pushes back again. Scholars argue that ancient texts often use vivid imagery to describe ritual objects or symbolic items. They warn against reading too much into mythic phrasing. They caution that linguistic ambiguities often lead to sensational interpretations. These cautions are valid. They serve as an essential check against overreach. But even when the mainstream perspective is presented fairly and respectfully, the anomalies remain. They accumulate, they echo, they point toward something not easily dismissed. And so the narrative tightens, the possibility sharpens. The story coalesces into a pattern that feels less like speculation and more like reconstruction. A reconstruction not of myth, but of memory. A memory of a world older than Sumer. A memory of knowledge carried across waters. A memory of cycles, civilizations rising, falling, and rising again. A memory that the earliest writers tried desperately to preserve. Because if the Sumerians truly inherited civilization, then the tablets they left behind are not the first chapter of human history. They are the first surviving chapter of a much longer book. And somewhere in those pages lies a turning point, a moment of catastrophe, a moment of revelation, a moment when the world as it was ended and the world as we know it began. That moment is approaching now in this narrative, gathering like a storm on the horizon. The clues grow sharper, the cycles align, the fragments converge. Something happened before Sumer, something vast, something that reshaped the human story so completely that only whispers remain. And the Sumerians, through clay, through symbols, through memory, tried to tell us what it was. As the fragments accumulate, texts, strata, star charts, king lists, the air thickens with a quiet inevitability. Something large is approaching in this story, something that the Sumerians themselves spoke of with reverence and fear. A turning point, a rupture. A memory so deep that even their meticulous clay tablets tremble at its edges. It begins with a series of references scattered across multiple sites: Nippur, Larsa, Eridu, Shuruppak. Each tablet alone is unremarkable. Just a few lines, a phrase, a metaphor. But when assembled, a single thread emerges, forming a picture less like mythology and more like a coded recollection. One text speaks of the time when the bonds of earth were broken. Another recalls a storm that darkened the midday sky. Another describes a roar like 1,000 winds. Another mentions the gods who fled to the high places. Another, the waters that came from above and below. And another, the cities lost beneath the horizon of the deep. These descriptions converge into something unsettlingly specific. A great catastrophe, not local but global. A cataclysm that wiped away not only cities, but memory itself, leaving the survivors to rebuild with only fragments of what once was. The Sumerians did not portray this as the dawn of their civilization. They portrayed it as the rebirth after the death of an older world. This catastrophe, whatever its true nature, forms the gravitational center of the Sumerian worldview. It is the event that separates the reigns before the flood from those after. It is the axis on which their entire history turns. It is the moment when kingship was withdrawn, the Mi scattered, the Anuna fled, and the world plunged into a darkness so complete that only a handful of voices survived to tell the story. This is the climax the tablets have been leading toward. But to understand it, one must gather all the pieces, not as isolated curiosities, but as a coherent reconstruction of what might have happened at the end of an earlier age. Evidence emerges from geology first. Across the Middle East, and indeed around the world, deposits of fine silt, sudden and uniform, interrupt otherwise continuous layers of human habitation. These layers date to different times in different places. But one, in particular, aligns with the strata beneath Shuruppak and other early Sumerian cities, a pulse of flooding around 2900 BCE. Yet deeper layers indicate earlier deluges corresponding to meltwater pulses at the end of the last ice age. This means the Sumerians inherited memories of more than one catastrophic flood. They remembered cycles, not singular events. Across multiple clay tablets, the same refrain appears. Once before that time, in the days of the ancients. The flood narrative of Ziusudra is not the first, merely the latest in a series of resets. Then there is the cosmic dimension. Several tablets reference celestial disturbances, a star that wandered from its place, a dark body that brought tears to the sky, and the upheaval of the heavens. These could be symbolic, but combined with geological evidence of climate instability, abrupt cooling, and impact proxies in ice cores, they suggest a broader pattern. That Earth has been subject to sudden climatic shocks capable of erasing whole cultures. Perhaps a comet fragment, perhaps a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps a rapid meltwater pulse, perhaps something else entirely, something the Sumerians described using the only language they had. The Epic of Gilgamesh hints at this through metaphor, a world drowned beneath despair, a darkness that lasts 7 days, a storm so violent the gods themselves retreated to the heavens like frightened birds. It is a poetic retelling of a memory so ancient it fused myth with trauma. But beneath the poetry lies a consistent structure: sudden destruction, a retreat of the knowledge keepers, a reset, and a restoration. Kulturkreis theory, an early anthropological idea, suggested that ancient civilizations shared a common origin. Though out of fashion today, the Sumerian tablets revive its resonance. The flood myths of cultures separated by oceans share too many specific details to be mere coincidence. A chosen survivor, a sealed vessel, animals preserved, a mountain of refuge, birds released to find land, an offering made after survival. These echoes imply not a shared imagination, but a shared memory. And if that memory reflects something real, something vast, then the Sumerians may have inherited not only stories, but roles. Roles in the rebuilding of civilization. Roles once held by figures who lived in the world before the catastrophe. This interpretation finds support in their obsession with order. Cosmic order, social order, administrative order. It explains their reverence for measurement, cycles, and standardization. If one had lived through civilizational collapse, order would become sacred. If one had inherited the fragments of an older world, structure would be survival. And so the Sumerians built their world not with experimentation, but with restoration. Their ziggurats were not inventions, but reconstructions of older designs. Their laws were not creations, but codifications of earlier principles. Their gods were not fantasy beings, but memories, ancestral figures elevated into myth. They were rebuilding a world they barely remembered. The anchor concept becomes clear. The Sumerians were the archivists of a lost age. Everything they wrote, built, and measured was an attempt to preserve order against the chaos that had once erased the world. Now the narrative reaches its peak, reconstructing the catastrophe itself. Imagine an earlier world, late in the Pleistocene or early in the Holocene, where humans lived in coastal settlements, river deltas, and fertile plains now lost beneath seas. These communities grew increasingly sophisticated, tracking star cycles, developing early agriculture, observing climate patterns, navigating along coastlines now submerged. Then imagine a sudden climatic event. Sea levels rising hundreds of feet in a geological instant, cities inundated, knowledge centers lost, populations displaced, survivors traveling inland, carrying memory but little else. Over generations, the knowledge dilutes, the stories distort, the survivors become legends. By the time the earliest Mesopotamian cities arose, the world before was already a myth. But myths preserve truths in symbolic language, and the Sumerians wrote those symbols with a precision that suggests more than imagination. They were encoding a memory whose trauma transcended writing itself. Several tablets describe the catastrophe in terms that feel too specific to ignore. One text speaks of the breath of annihilation sweeping across the land. Another of 7 days of darkness when the sun did not rise. Another of the waters rising until the mountains were covered. Another of a great noise that shattered the earth's foundations. Taken together, these resemble the signatures of a large-scale geophysical event: widespread fires, global dimming from atmospheric dust, rapid sea level rise, and seismic upheavals. Modern science acknowledges that the end of the last ice age included abrupt warming, meltwater floods, and possible cosmic impacts. The Sumerian memories, written thousands of years later, appear to echo these distant events. But the most puzzling part is not the catastrophe itself. It is the recovery. After the flood, after the darkness, after the destruction, the Sumerian texts describe a deliberate act. Kingship being lowered from heaven again. Not invented. Not discovered. Returned. This language haunts scholars because it offers no easy interpretation. If read symbolically, it means the restoration of political order. If read literally, it implies an outside source of authority, something or someone descending into the post-cataclysmic world to guide the survivors. Who these figures were is unclear. Another text describes them as the great ones who determine destinies. Yet another calls them those who know the measures. Another portrays them as teachers, giving humans agriculture, writing, calendars, and architecture. Were these simply mythic ancestors, elite survivors of a pre-flood society? Foreign groups arriving from a less affected region? Or something else entirely? Entities interpreted as gods, but perhaps representing a remnant enclave of advanced knowledge? The Sumerians leave the question open. They never insist on divinity. They simply record the roles, and those roles imply continuity. The climax sharpens further when examining the earliest temples. Enki's temple at Eridu, for instance, contains architectural layers stretching back thousands of years. The earliest levels are tiny, simple shrines. But as the levels rise, the design becomes more complex. Then suddenly, in one particular phase, the temple architecture leaps forward, gaining a sophistication far ahead of its time. This abrupt transformation aligns too neatly with the Sumerian narrative: a restoration, a return, a reordering. Where did this sudden architectural knowledge come from? The mainstream explanation is that innovations spread from community to community, but innovations do not appear in a single city without precursors. They evolve. They spread gradually. Yet here, the leap is instantaneous. Another mystery lies in their mathematics. The sexagesimal, base 60 system appears complete from its first appearance. No simpler precursor exists. This system allowed the Sumerians to create precise calendars, perform advanced geometry, and predict celestial cycles. But why base 60? Why a system so elegant, yet so unnatural for human counting? Some scholars suggest it was chosen for its divisibility. Others hint it may have been inherited from an older culture that favored astronomical calculations. Then there is the question of writing. The earliest cuneiform tablets show not a primitive script, but a structured, standardized writing system clearly derived from earlier forms that have not survived. Writing systems do not begin at complexity. They grow into it. Yet Sumer's appears already mature. This implies an earlier writing tradition lost in the catastrophe, one preserved in fragments through memory. The pieces now converge: sudden civilization, precise astronomy, mature writing, standardized law, inherited knowledge, cycles of catastrophe, restoration by unknown figures. All these fragments point toward a world erased and rebuilt. The climax reaches its full weight when we consider the Sumerian calendar. Its earliest form tracks not only lunar months and solar years, but long celestial cycles spanning thousands of years. These cycles, such as the precessional movement of certain stars, require observational continuity across generations, continuity impossible for a civilization just emerging from primitive life. Yet the Sumerians treat these cycles as familiar. They calibrate them. They measure them. They reference them casually, as if they inherited a time-keeping system already ancient when they began using it. This raises a profound question. Who first tracked these long cycles? Perhaps a culture whose existence lies beneath the oceans. Perhaps coastal societies drowned by rising seas. Perhaps a people whose observatories now lie scattered under Mediterranean waters, the Persian Gulf, the Black Sea, the Indian Ocean. Modern underwater archaeology has uncovered dozens of submerged settlements across the world, some older than the earliest known Mesopotamian cities. What knowledge drowned with them? The Sumerians provide perhaps the only surviving record from that lost world. Their flood stories, their star maps, their king lists, their inherited knowledge, all may be echoes of those drowned cultures. And if so, the Sumerian tablets are not memories of one flood, but of many, not of one cycle, but of countless cycles etched into human history. This brings us to the closing arc, the gradual descent from the climax into reflection. Because if the Sumerians indeed carried memories of an older world, then everything we assume about the origins of civilization becomes fluid. Perhaps civilization did not begin once. Perhaps it began many times, rising and falling in cycles that stretch across millennia. Perhaps each epoch inherited fragments from the last, like torches passed across floodwaters. Perhaps humanity has been climbing out of darkness again and again. And perhaps the Sumerians are simply the first voices to have survived long enough to write it down. The idea is not new. Plato hinted at it in his dialogues, recounting Egyptian priests telling Solon that humanity has been wiped out repeatedly by fire and water, with only a few survivors each time. Indian scriptures refer to cycles of creation and destruction across vast timescales. Indigenous traditions across the world speak of earlier worlds, forgotten ages, lost peoples. The Sumerians, however, do something unique. They provide dates, names, lineages, roles, cities, technologies. They ground the myth in administrative detail. Their memories carry structure. This structure forms a bridge, a fragile one, between mythic past and scientific possibility. It does not prove a lost civilization existed, but it suggests the earliest civilizations preserved memories beyond their era. And that may be the most profound truth of all: human memory is older than human history. In the final reflection, the emphasis shifts from evidence to meaning. What does it say about humanity that our earliest writers describe cycles, not linear progress? What does it mean that the Sumerians saw their world as a restoration, not a beginning? Why did they feel compelled to record their past with such relentless detail? Perhaps they feared that memory itself could die. Perhaps they knew how easily knowledge can vanish. Perhaps they understood better than we do the fragility of civilization. The Sumerians lived in a world where catastrophe was not a distant possibility, but a remembered fact. They wrote because they knew what forgetting cost. They measured the sky because they believed patterns held warnings. They preserved knowledge because someone had preserved it for them. Seen through this lens, the tablets take on a quiet, solemn beauty. They are not just histories. They are lifelines reaching back into earlier ages, connecting us with worlds erased by time. And the questions they leave behind are not frightening, but humbling. What if our timeline is only one chapter in a far older book? What if the origins of civilization lie not in Sumer, but beneath forgotten seas? What if human history is not a straight ascent, but a pulse, expanding, collapsing, returning? What if the memories of those lost worlds survive in the oldest stories, waiting for us to hear them? As the lights dim around this narrative, the mood softens. The oceans of the past grow quiet. The tablets return to silence. The ancient cities fade into the dust. And the Sumerians, those calm voices from the dawn of writing, leave us with a final, lingering thought. Civilization may not begin when we think it does. It may return. And somewhere, beneath layers of earth and water, beneath myths and memories, beneath the rise and fall of ages, the story of humanity may be far older and far stranger than anything found in our textbooks.